Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todos, bienvenidos, un placer de que nos acompañen ya a través de nuestra señal de streaming, canal de YouTube de la ANEP, que nos posibilita llegar a ustedes para celebrar, para compartir y para comenzar este tan esperado encuentro que corresponde al 17º Foro de Lenguas organizado por la Dirección de Políticas Lingüísticas de la ANEP. Así que un verdadero placer que ya estén allí, ya estamos verificando, chequeando el chat, vemos mucha gente ya en sintonía con nosotros para compartir las distintas ponencias en esta tarde en el Foro de Lenguas, que sin duda se ha convertido en un momento esperado por los docentes de Uruguay por tratarse de una nueva oportunidad para la formación y actualización en materia de enseñanza y aprendizaje de lenguas. Así que gracias por estar, por apoyar la iniciativa, agradecer a quienes nos acompañan, por supuesto con un grupo reducido aquí en el edificio principal de la ANEP, en nuestro salón de actos, porque el objetivo era que este foro precisamente fuera en términos virtuales para que ustedes puedan recibir las distintas ponencias que ya están preparadas y que en minutos vamos a comenzar. Yo le voy a pedir al equipo que switchee la cámara y ya tengamos plano de esta mesa principal con el logo de la Administración Nacional de Educación Pública, con nuestra pantalla donde ya está el logo característico del Foro de Lenguas de la ANEP en su edición 17 y ya podemos visualizar a las autores que agradecemos, por supuesto, por el apoyo y que nos acompañen en esta apertura que queremos realizar junto al consejero presidente de ANEP en ejercicio, Juan Gavito Soboli, junto a la consejera Dora Graciano. Estimada consejera, gracias por estar. Al centro de la mesa también nos acompaña Aldo Rodríguez como director de la Dirección de Políticas Lingüísticas de la ANEP y a su lado está Sandra Mosca, que es referente técnico del equipo de PROLE y que en segundos nada más nos va a estar dando el contexto de este encuentro, de este Foro de Lenguas que comenzamos a celebrar y que vamos a compartir durante esta tarde a través de nuestro canal de YouTube de la ANEP. Agradecerle a Leticia también, la subdirectora de Políticas Lingüísticas, Leticia, a todo el equipo, referentes, representaciones diplomáticas por acompañarnos. Una vez más, gracias por estar, bienvenidos y esperemos, por supuesto, que el Foro de Lenguas sea muy importante para todos ustedes con las distintas presentaciones que tenemos para compartir. Momento de comenzar la apertura, momento de brindarle la palabra a Sandra Mosca como referente técnica del equipo de PROLE para que inicie este encuentro con motivo del 17º Foro de Lenguas. Sandra, adelante.
Bien, gracias Marcelo. Bueno, buenas tardes para todos. Muchas gracias a los consejeros por acompañarnos en esta tarde. Y el 17º Foro de ANEP, que se inaugura hoy, está dedicado al proyecto Biblioteca Solidaria, que es el proyecto que el Programa de Lectura y Escritura en Español desarrolla desde hace 10 años en el marco de la Dirección de Políticas Lingüísticas, que es quien organiza este evento año a año. O sea, estamos en casa, estamos este año enfocados en este proyecto, en la trayectoria y la historia de esta propuesta que se desarrolla desde 2014 en casi 1000 escuelas en todo nuestro territorio uruguayo. Y bueno, como muchos de ustedes saben, Biblioteca Solidaria involucra a toda la comunidad educativa, a docentes, a los niños, a los mediadores de lectura de la comunidad, en la vinculación de los niños con la cultura escrita. La propuesta de Biblioteca Solidaria es justamente incluir a los niños desde muy pequeños en esto que es la cultura escrita, a través de la lectura de libros de literatura infantil. Y para ello invitamos a la comunidad a que se acerque a las escuelas y comparta a través de la voz de los mediadores, quienes llevan con su lectura novedosa, con su impronta, los cuentos a los niños. Entonces, bueno, la jornada de hoy va a estar dedicada a Biblioteca Solidaria y, como es habitual para nuestro proyecto, además de compartir todos los años y de hacer llegar materiales a las escuelas, intentamos de alguna manera colaborar con la formación, con el crecimiento profesional de los docentes Y en este caso, en la jornada de hoy, traemos dos conferencias de importantes académicos, como son el doctor Felipe Munita, de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, y Janine Mats, donde ambos van a estar refiriéndose a la mediación de la lectura y haciendo sus aportes a nivel académico sobre estas áreas que tienen que ver con la lectura, la mediación, la lectura de literatura. Y bueno, justamente los invitamos a todos a seguir la transmisión de este foro y escuchar las conferencias de estos dos destacados académicos que seguramente van a aportar muchísimo al conocimiento del marco teórico, de las referencias teóricas que hacen al proyecto de Biblioteca Solidaria. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Querida Sandra, bueno, ahí estábamos chequeando el chat. Mónica presente, dice que buena oportunidad de estar en contacto. Mariana también, buenas tardes, me estoy sumando. Adriana Pascual, Silvia también, Valeria, qué bueno, ya estamos conectados, así que fantástico para quienes nos siguen a través de la señal de YouTube de nuestro canal. Momento de convocar al director de Políticas Lingüísticas de la ANEP, Aldo Rodríguez. Aldo, te escuchamos.
Bueno, buenas tardes para todos y bienvenidos al 17º Foro de Lenguas. Gracias por acompañarnos a los que están aquí hoy y a los que están a través de la señal de YouTube de la ANEP. Como dijo Sandra, y voy a retomar un par de conceptos de los que dijo Sandra, este año está dedicado a Biblioteca Solidaria. A lo largo del país uno puede ver cómo las comunidades educativas se han apropiado de este proyecto de Biblioteca Solidaria. En las recorridas que hacemos habitualmente por las escuelas, tanto urbanas como rurales, podemos ver cómo los niños han buscado formas creativas de trabajar con Biblioteca Solidaria. Viene a mi mente, por ejemplo, una escuela en Salto que puso en la plaza, una escuela rural, que puso en la plaza del pueblito una heladera con los libros y van una vez a la semana a leerle a los abuelos. Y le hacen una biblioteca solidaria reversa, digamos, de lo que está planteada como proyecto. O otros casos en donde las comunidades han solicitado que ampliemos el proyecto Biblioteca Solidaria. Quiero referirme específicamente al departamento de Rivera, donde se nos pidió que, aparte de leer en español, querían leer en portugués. Y es en ese sentido que este año Biblioteca Solidaria se amplió a 3 idiomas. Se amplió a inglés, se amplió a francés y se amplió a portugués. En el caso de francés tuvimos una donación de libros de la Embajada de Canadá. También hemos tenido donaciones de la Embajada de Francia, que aquí se encuentra presente Laurence, a quien le agradecemos muchísimo por todo el apoyo. Y también estamos teniendo Biblioteca Solidaria en portugués, también y fundamentalmente gracias al apoyo de la Embajada de Brasil. Como decía Sandra, una de las cosas que nos gusta hacer es la capacitación. Creemos que la lectura es muy importante, pero que el desarrollo de la competencia necesita también de su formación. Pero este año el Foro de Lenguas sería como el cierre a un grupo, a una cantidad de eventos que hemos creado en referencia a Biblioteca Solidaria. Hubo campamentos donde fueron los referentes de lectura. También hicimos para la Feria del Libro los cuerpos diplomáticos de Francia, de Canadá, de Suiza, de Armenia, de Brasil, de Portugal, estuvieron leyéndoles cuentos a sus niños, a los niños de las escuelas, cuyos nombres llevan las escuelas, y creemos que este proyecto es un gran proyecto que impacta, como dijo Sandra, en más del 50% de las escuelas que tenemos en nuestro país. Entonces, por eso pensamos que el foro de este año tenía que estar centrado en ello. Y por eso también queremos agradecer a la Embajada de Estados Unidos que ha colaborado con uno de los ponentes que vamos a escuchar hoy. Todo esto es para decirles que en el ámbito de políticas lingüísticas y en el ámbito de la mediación en particular hay algo que se da, que es la circulación de saberes. Y la mediación que comenzó con el español y con el trabajo que se hacía desde el proyecto inicial y primario de Biblioteca Solidaria se ha ido extendiendo a las segundas lenguas y esperemos que en el futuro próximo se extienda a otras más. Así que les doy a todos la bienvenida, que disfruten de estas conferencias que vamos a tener en el día de hoy respecto de la mediación en la lectura y que, bueno, que sean fructíferos y que nos encontremos en muchas escuelas con muchos voluntarios que quieran ir a leerles los libros de cuentos a los niños. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien. Gracias, Aldo, como director del equipo de política lingüística. Siguen llegando, se están sumando, Se está sumando gente ya de a poco al streaming. Acá, buenas tardes. Karina dice felicitaciones por este proyecto maravilloso. Después, Roxy, qué hermoso trabajo están realizando. ¿Cómo disfrutamos del campamento? Me dice Adriana. Eso, ustedes saben ya la interna del equipo. Y algunos me preguntan que, por supuesto, ya les comento que esto va a quedar registrado, grabado, como tradicionalmente se pasa en YouTube. Así que para aquellos que no puedan ingresar para compartir en vivo, va a quedar en la página web de la ANEP en el marco del Foro de Lenguas para quienes quieran compartir las presentaciones que vamos a celebrar en minutos nada más. Estimado consejero, presidente en ejercicio de la ANEP, Juan Gavito, nos va a compartir algunas palabras y luego sí ya comenzamos con las presentaciones.
Bien, muchas gracias, Marcelo. Un saludo cordial a cada uno de los presentes y a los que nos siguen a través del streaming. Yo me uno a las palabras de bienvenida de Aldo y de agradecimiento, empezando por los representantes de los países amigos que nos acompañan. Merci beaucoup, mesdames. Grazie tante, profesoressa. Porque realmente es para nosotros un honor que nos acompañen hoy en este momento en que en representación del Consejo Directivo Central, con la profesora Dora Graciano aquí a mi izquierda, lo representamos, decía, y les traemos el saludo de nuestra presidenta, doctora Cáceres, que está en el exterior en una misión oficial. Pero es una oportunidad en la cual nosotros tenemos que celebrar no solo 10 años y 17 años, 10 años de la Biblioteca Solidaria y 17 años del Foro, sino la continuidad de una política educativa en materia de idiomas, en materia de educación lingüística. Yo comentaba antes de empezar con Aldo que el Foro para mí empezó antes de que se hubiera sancionado la actual Ley de Educación, que es nuestro marco jurídico rector, digamos así. Y en su artículo 40, literal E, esta ley nos dice que tenemos que establecer una educación lingüística en todos los niveles y modalidades. Y sobre todo para los compatriotas que nos están escuchando a través del streaming, quiero subrayar que ya en ese momento se hablaba de competencias, un término que ha sido tan discutido últimamente cuando a través de la transformación curricular nosotros dentro del nuevo marco curricular pusimos énfasis en el enfoque competencial. Decía y dice la ley desde el año 2008 que la educación lingüística tendrá como propósito el desarrollo de las competencias comunicativas de las personas. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Leer, escribir, pero sobre todo comprender, poderse comunicar y, ¿por qué no?, también interesarse por la ventana al mundo que implica la apertura del dominio de una nueva lengua. Y tiene varios incisos, pero el último dice: la formación plurilingüe a través de la enseñanza de segundas lenguas y lenguas extranjeras, es decir, el multilingüismo que tanto nosotros estamos impulsando. De modo que yo termino entonces, por un lado, agradeciendo el esfuerzo que la Dirección de Políticas Lingüísticas ha hecho a lo largo de este tiempo, que nos ha permitido mantener, como dije antes, no quiero hablar de una política de Estado, pero sí una continuidad en un enfoque académico, que se basa obviamente en los profesionales que están al frente, y entonces yo quiero reconocer en los dos colegas que están a mi derecha esa circunstancia. Ya lo dije también a los países amigos que siempre nos dan su apoyo. Y por último, aunque pueda sonar que no tiene que ver con esto, a la Dirección de Comunicaciones, porque también a través de su calidez y su profesionalismo, pero sobre todo al dominio eficiente de las nuevas tecnologías, nos permite comunicarnos con todo el universo de quienes nos siguen. Así que felicitaciones y éxito entonces en esta nueva instancia del foro. Gracias a todos.
Agradecemos las palabras del consejero Juan Gavito y aprovecho la instancia para agradecerle también el mensaje y el apoyo al equipo de la Dirección de Comunicación, que como dice el consejero, está trabajando para que en el punto de vista técnico, por supuesto, llegue esta transmisión. Así que el agradecimiento. Estimado Juan Gavito, estimada Dora Graciano, Aldo y por supuesto Sandra, vamos a comenzar entonces con las presentaciones. Así ya le pido allí a Leo que preparemos la primera presentación. Vamos a ir en pantalla ya con el banner de qué se trata y quién nos va a acompañar en esta primera ponencia en el marco del Foro de Lenguas de la ANEP en su edición 17, organizado por la Dirección de Política Lingüística. ¿Estamos prontos? Ustedes me dicen cuando gusten, mientras agradecemos a todos quienes siguen sumando al chat y por supuesto la transmisión, así que les agradecemos por estar en sintonía con el canal de YouTube. ¿Perfecto? Bueno, vamos entonces, adelante.
Hi, teachers. Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. Greetings from Quito, Ecuador. My name is Janine Matz. I am a professor of the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador, sede Quito, of linguistics. I also work for Relo Andes, and I'm here today to present to you the topic of guided self-selected reading, GSSR, a catalyst for second language acquisition. So let's get started. What are we going to look at today? So we can see the table of contents here. We have some theory, right? What theory are we going to base all of this practice on? What is the research in second language acquisition that supports GSSR? We have practice, how to apply GSSR in your classroom. And finally, we're going to take a look at some free resources. They're open access for you and also for your students. So let's start with a little bit of theory, right? What does SLA research say about GSSR? What do we know from second language acquisition research that can help us to defend the use of GSSR, right? Well, we can ask ourselves, what do we need to know? What do we need, to acquire a language? What do we need to acquire a language? We've known for almost 50 years, thanks to Dr. Stephen Krashen and others, and several others, but starting with Dr. Stephen Krashen in the 1980s, we know that comprehensible input is essential for acquisition, and lots of it, right? This can be spoken input or written input. We know that without input, there is no language acquisition happening, right? Okay, in that case, what is GSSR? Let's define it. GSSR can be defined as an instructional approach that emphasizes learner autonomy in reading by allowing students to choose their own reading materials, of course, with teacher guidance and support. Right? This encourages students to engage with texts that interest them, leading to increased motivation, enhanced reading comprehension, and improved vocabulary acquisition. I'm sure you all remember being students of English, right? And your English teachers back in high school, grammar school, and sometimes they had you read texts that were just not so interesting to you, right? Maybe texts about the American Civil War or texts about other subjects that are not very fascinating for teenagers, right? The idea with GSSR is to get students to read things that they would naturally be more interested in, right? This is grounded in theories of extensive reading, which suggest that regular exposure to comprehensible input helps learners internalize language structures and vocabulary. So what research has been done on this? Well, we have several years of research focused on reading from a perspective of applied linguistics. We can go all the way back to the end of the previous century, last century, right, where we had Mason and Crash in 1997, who researched extensive reading in the context of Japanese learners that were engaged in extensive self-selected reading. What did they find? That they significantly improved their language proficiency compared to those who followed traditional methods. What do we mean by traditional methods in this case? You all know those activities where we have to fill in the blank with the verb conjugated in the present perfect continuous, right? And then we have all the verbs in parentheses and the students go through the subject and they conjugate the verb in their worksheets. This is what we mean by traditional methods: mechanical exercises, drilling, memorization, things like that, right? So the participants in their study did much better in their language proficiency than those who were taught using these traditional methods. Day and Bamford in 1998 and then again in 2002 looked at extensive reading of authentic material, especially when guided and self-selected, leads to improvements in reading fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary acquisition. We even acquire new vocabulary when we read in our native language, right? None of us has a complete vocabulary of all the words that exist in our native language. So we can acquire new vocabulary even in our first language through reading. Then we have Krashen, who looked at free voluntary reading. FVR advocates for the importance of self-selected reading as a means of improving language proficiency. When students read materials they choose themselves, they are more motivated, which enhances language acquisition outcomes. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the affective filter, which is also a contribution of Krashen, right? The affective filter is like this wall, this barrier, that goes up in our brains when we have negative sentiments towards the subject that we're learning. It's not just languages. It can be math, science, social studies. So if we have negative feelings towards what we are trying to learn, there's this wall that is built in our brains, and we have a very difficult time acquiring that new, for example, in this case, the new language, or learning the new information, because it's almost like these negative feelings block what we're trying to acquire, right? So if we have positive feelings by seeing that we get to choose the reading that we work with instead of it being imposed on us, we are more open to receiving the language in that reading, right? And then we have Laufer in 2003, incidental vocabulary learning shows that learners can acquire a significant amount of vocabulary through extensive reading without explicit instruction. How is that possible? The same way we do it in our first language, right? By simply using context to figure out the meaning of words that we don't know. Obviously, if the text is too difficult for the students, they will get frustrated because they have too many words that they don't know. So it's important to choose texts that are within the reach of the student's level of acquisition, right? Okay. These were some preliminary beginning studies, right? These were the pioneer studies, let's say, at the end of the last century and the beginning of this century. But we've done a lot since then. There's a lot more research done on GSSR. More recent research, as we can see from this decade, we can see, for example, the first study here, that's Mason and Krashen. Benico Mason and Stephen Krashen are the two most important figures in research on guided self-selected reading. Both of them are linguists. Benico Mason is a Japanese linguist and Stephen Krashen is a North American linguist. Right, so in 2020, they looked at GSSR combined with story listening on EFL learners in Japan. What is story listening? It's exactly what the name says. So that means that we listen to stories and we acquire language through listening to stories. What did they find in their study? Showed significant gains in both reading comprehension and vocabulary acquisition. GSSR facilitates long-term language development and fosters motivation to read independently. Dr. Krashen in 2022 found that GSSR prepares students for FVR, free voluntary reading, remember, by offering structured support and encouraging autonomous learning habits. GSSR, with emphasis on interesting, comprehensible texts, leads to measurable improvements in second language proficiency. Another study just from last year, Mason and Krashen in 2023, explored the effects of GSSR and story listening over a sustained period. It found that students who participated in GSSR programs exhibited better language retention and overall linguistic competence compared to those using traditional grammar-based instruction, like the one I explained to you before, right? And if we think about all of this research, we say, it kind of makes sense, because what do stories have? What is characteristic of stories, for example? Looking at children's stories, I'm sure you are all familiar with children's stories like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the Three Little Pigs, those types of stories. What is unique about those stories? Those stories are simplified language. They're not complex, right? The level of the language is simplified because it's for children. There are illustrations, there's often repetition, right? So we have a language that's already been tailored to a level of language that is lower, right? That we can actually learn from. Yeah, that's why children's stories are so effective in language teaching and in language acquisition, because the quality of the input in children's stories is really great for our learners. Yeah. Okay. Continuing. So here's a question. Maybe this looks like some of your students, I don't know, right? But here's a question. If we know all of this, if we have, let's say, over 25 years of research on the effectiveness of story listening, of GSSR, of reading for language acquisition specifically, why are we not applying all of this science in the EFL classroom? I would like you to take a minute to think about this. And if it is possible for your facilitators that are running the show right now, if they can pause the video and you can maybe have some interaction among yourselves, that would be great. You could take a moment right now for you to speculate why we are not applying all of this science in the EFL classroom. Yeah, so take a moment to think about it, discuss it with your neighbor if it's possible. Push pause on the video, and then I will offer some of what I think might be happening, right? So let's take a look at the coronavirus for a moment, okay? We all remember the coronavirus. Follow the metaphor here. Okay, when the coronavirus happened, in the beginning of 2020, we were all in shock. We didn't know what to do. There was this virus that was killing people. We had to be quarantined. We were all scared. right? What did we do? We looked to science. We looked to the doctors and to the experts and to the scientists who were researching the coronavirus. And we found that they had some recommendations for us, right? Stand 2 meters apart from each other, wear masks, use alcohol on your hands, disinfect your groceries. Do you remember when we disinfected groceries? In Ecuador, we disinfected groceries. It was a different world, right? Okay, fine. And then when the vaccines came out, when we got the vaccines, we said, okay, we have vaccines. We're going to get a vaccine so that we don't die from coronavirus because the scientists told us this is what we should do. Okay, language teaching is similar. We have years and years of scientific research about how we should teach languages, but for some reasons, it is not trickling down into the classrooms. And this is not only the case in my context of Ecuador, or in your context of Uruguay, or in Latin American context. It is the case all around the world. From developing countries to first world countries, we are still teaching languages very traditionally. This might be the case in part because of simply not knowing that these studies exist. You can think, if you have classes in your pensum, in your curriculum on language acquisition, if we don't know about the studies done in language acquisition, how can we possibly apply them to our classroom, right? Another reason is because change is difficult. Change is very difficult. You tell someone, teach differently than you've always been taught, and some people are very reluctant to change, right? It requires effort. It requires energy. It requires creativity. And sometimes people don't want to do that. Or they say, I learned English this way, so I'm going to continue teaching English this way. But we can't do that anymore because we have so much research that tells us how we should teach languages, right? And part of this research is based on the importance of reading and acquisition, yeah? But if we're not familiar with these findings, how can we apply them in the classroom? Of course. Okay. That's why it was so important to look at the theory for the first part of this presentation. Without understanding the science behind why this is the case, why we should be using GSSR, for example, how can we implement it in the classroom? Now we're going to take all of that theory, all of that research, all of the scientific findings, and we're going to see how we can put those into practice. In other words, how do we work with GSSR with our students? Okay. I'm going to share with you guys some elements that we can incorporate in our classrooms. Everyone's reality is slightly different, of course, right? In the context of Uruguay, which I am not completely familiar with, you may be able to do some of these things, but not all of these things. Maybe it depends if you are in a public school or in a private school. In the case of Ecuador, there is a big difference between English teaching in a private school and English teaching in a public school. In the public schools in Ecuador, we do not have any internet. We don't have computers in 90% of public schools. We don't have any technology, any projectors, anything. So in that case, we might not be able to use all of these tips for our particular context, right? So you have to adapt to your reality. Some of these things will work, some will not work, depending on your context, right? But let's look at implementing GSSR in our classrooms. What can we do? Well, first, we can build a classroom library. As it says here, create a diverse and engaging classroom library that includes books from different genres, levels, and topics. This allows students to choose texts that interest them, fostering a love for reading and improving language skills. Include graded readers and authentic texts appropriate for learners' proficiency levels. And here I have in parentheses, Krashen's I+1. Okay, Krashen's I+1, if you are not familiar with Stephen Krashen and his input hypothesis, basically says that we should provide input to our students that is just a little bit above their current language level. Why is this? Because we want them to acquire new language, but at the same time, we don't want to make it too challenging for them where they get overwhelmed, right? Like we can imagine if we give our students a text that is, let's say, a B2 level, and our students are only A2 level in our classrooms, according to the Common European Framework of Reference, what's going to happen? We give our students a text, they open it to the first page and they say, teacher, no entiendo nada. No entiendo, teacher, no voy a leer. They're blocked, right? They're automatically blocked. So we have to be sensitive to their actual level of language and give them something that's just a little bit above that, okay? What do we mean by authentic text or authentic material? This means material that was not necessarily created for EFL learners, but was created for native English speakers. And you say, how is that possible? A native English speaker has a better level of English. Yes, to a certain extent, but we can use, like I mentioned before, children's books. Children's books are simplified language. So we can start with children's stories, the classics, yeah? That's authentic material because it wasn't written for someone who is learning English as a foreign language. It was just written in English. You see the difference? Yeah, so this is something important to consider. Where do we get these books from? I can't go to the store and buy a bunch of books in English for my class because we are teachers. And I think around the world, in most countries, our salaries are not the best, right? So how do we acquire new books for our classroom library? There are different ways. We can look to a Facebook page. A lot of Facebook communities donate books back and forth. So you can check on Facebook. Maybe there is somewhere near your city or town that actually does book exchanges or donates books. You can ask the US embassies. Sometimes the US embassies, or maybe also the British embassies, perhaps, in some countries do have books that are donated. Yeah, sometimes they give these. I know in the case of Ecuador, in Quito, we have the Peace Corps, Cuerpo de Paz, right? And there's often books that are donated to them from English teachers, and then other teachers can take those books. So sometimes we can get books that way. And another way is to simply ask colleagues, or maybe you know some native speakers. Just last week, I had someone from the south of Ecuador ask me if I happened to have any books because they wanted to start building a classroom library. I have a son who is 8 years old and he is bilingual and he reads books in English too. And I have books that were from when he was 5. So I could take those books and I donated them to this teacher who asked for a donation of books. So there are many sources we can get books from, and in your context, maybe you know some more sources. Okay, we can also do reader workshops. Yeah, readers workshops. Students select their own books and read independently during class. Teachers provide guidance by helping students choose texts that are challenging but accessible. Students then reflect on their reading through discussions or journaling, encouraging metacognitive awareness of their progress. A lot of us are talking about metacognitive things lately, right? Metacognitive activities. What do we mean in this case about metacognitive? Having them reflect on the process of reading these books. In other words, saying, how was that experience for you? Did you like reading this book in English? What was difficult for you? What was easy for you? What will you do next time when you choose a book? Will you choose the same type of book? What strategies will you use to understand the book better, etc., etc.? Okay? So we can incorporate readers' workshops during class time if we have time for it in our classes, right? What else can we do? Reading logs and reflection. So to increase accountability with their independent reading, students record the titles, authors, and summaries of the text they read. They can also include personal reflections on what they learned, new vocabulary they encountered, and how the text relates to their interest. Personally, I think that the reflection component is extremely important because that allows our students to connect with the reading and therefore English as well on a more personal level. Yeah. If they can reflect about the book, bring it into their own life. What does the main character have to do with me, for example? Or how does the lesson in this story affect me? Things like that. I think this is a very valuable component of a reading log. It makes it more like a diary. It's more personal. A summary anyone can write. They can find a summary on ChatGPT of the book, but a different thing is a reflection, and it also requires more critical thinking. So this is really great, right? Also, I can have a separate notebook or like a really tiny notebook like this big that they can take with them everywhere, put it in their pocket, right? And every new word that they learn from reading, they can write in their little notebooks with a definition in English, their own definition, what they understand it to be, or with an example of the sentence they found it in, or whatever. So they end up with their own little pocket dictionaries. It's not in alphabetical order, but they will see how much their vocabulary is increasing, and that will be very positive for them as well. Okay, discussions and presentations. When students finish a book, they can participate in group discussions or give presentations about what they read. This fosters oral language practice and deepens comprehension. Students can share their thoughts on the characters, plot, or information, which enhances critical thinking and conversational skills. I would like to make a little parenthesis right here. Nowadays, in foreign language teaching, we realized that it's okay to use the first language sometimes for strategic moments in the class, okay? If your students are not that fluent in English yet, they cannot express themselves too well yet in English, but they are reading these short stories, short books, why not allow them the opportunity to have this discussion in Spanish or in their first language? Why not? Because if we're focusing on reading, right, then it's fine. That's all in English. They have to read the whole text in English. But to be able to discuss it in Spanish is also interesting because they have to have understood the text well in English. Yeah, so maybe you want to consider giving them a minute or a couple minutes to actually be able to discuss about the books that they read in Spanish. This is a technique called translanguaging, where we switch between the L1 and the L2 for strategic moments in the classroom. We don't translate, right? But we allow them the freedom to have enjoyed the book and be able to share something about it in Spanish. So this is something that I put out there as an option for you to consider if you would like to for your classes, okay? Lastly, for this part, we have goal setting in GSSR. So encouraging students to set a personal reading goal is key. For instance, students may set goals to read a certain number of books per month or to explore specific genres or themes. Teachers can guide students in setting realistic and attainable goals, which promotes self-regulation and motivation in language learning. So if you see your students as being very goal-oriented, you can have them set goals for themselves. Okay, how many books of 20 pages, simple children's books, do I want to read in a month? I think I can do 5 or 1 a week, 4 or something like that. That's realistic, right? We can also do readers' workshops. So students select their own books and read independently during class. And then, of course, the teachers provide guidance through those books as well. Yeah? Okay. Let's continue. Here we're going to take a look at some resources that are available to you as EFL teachers, and for your students, they can access these for free. Sometimes the hardest part of implementing GSSR in the classroom is knowing where we can find resources, knowing where we can find materials. Yeah? A lot of times there is a lot of material on the internet, but it's not very well organized or it's not very well presented to us. right? So we're going to take a look at some sources that you can make use of to try to implement GSSR in your classrooms. Unfortunately, because of the time constraints, we cannot go through each specific source and look at explore every web page, but I do include here the names of the web pages and also the web addresses so that you guys can take a look on your own time. Okay, these sources, the first ones that I present here are the sources for you teachers to learn more. Yeah. So these are my personal recommendations to learn more about this, but of course there are other sources on the internet. It's as simple as either using Google to search for GSSR, but make sure that you put guided self-selected reading, because there are also other things that have the acronym GSSR. So make sure you type out the whole phrase. Stephen Krashen's website. Stephen Krashen and Beniko Mason will deal with these together, right? They both have their own websites. We have sdkrashen.com and benikomason.net. Both of these linguists provide a lot of scientific evidence to support GSSR and the importance of reading and acquisition. Yeah. These websites aesthetically are not the prettiest websites. They are not. They are very primitive. They are a little bit, I don't know, maybe not the prettiest, but they have a lot of relevant information. More than anything, they have scientific articles that have been published to support the importance of reading and acquisition. And the good thing about this is that both of these websites are free. On Stephen Krashen's website, he has a lot of books and articles going all the way back to the 1980s with his book with Tracy Terrell in The Natural Approach. Yeah, the whole book is uploaded to his website in PDF format. So this is a great resource if you are studying a master's or PhD program and you want to investigate these topics more. You have a lot of resources here that are free that you can download and read and use. Yeah. We also have Colin McQuillan's website, who is another linguist. Colin McQuillan is another linguist who has done a lot of research on the importance of reading and acquisition. So I invite you to check out his website that is called backseatlinguist.com. We also have Facebook pages. The main one that is actually run by Beniko Mason is Story Listening and Guided Self-Selected Reading. Become a member of that Facebook page, of that Facebook community. You have a lot of resources there. It will teach you more about GSSR. It gives you more scientific evidence, but it also gives you some story listening videos that are recorded that you can use with your classes, right? So this is a nice Facebook page. We also have another one called Guided Reading for Educators. This is another great resource that we can also use on Facebook. So I know Facebook is not so popular anymore and Instagram is much more popular now, but Facebook still remains a very good platform to build communities around these types of topics. So I invite you to like or follow those Facebook pages. What about resources for you and your students to use? So these are only a couple of them. Of course, there are more. I invite you to ask Google or ask ChatGPT or any other artificial intelligence for more resources. But here are some. The University of Hawaii has ESL Open Educational Resources graded readers, which means that they separated the texts that they provide into levels: beginner, beginner intermediate, intermediate, advanced, etc. So you can go to this webpage and you can use those graded readers. They're open access, free. Yeah. And depending on the level of your students, you can choose which section is most appropriate for you based on their level. We also have the Extensive Reading Foundation free graded readers. And here's the web address. This one is separated according to levels by the Common European Framework of Reference. So if your students are A1 level, at the top of the page, you can click on A1 and you see the graded readers that they provide for A1 level. A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, even C2 I've seen. So this is a great resource as well because the readers are already categorized by the level of the students. Yeah, we also have Open Library, which includes a lot of different things that are interesting. We not only have books on this page, but we also have the opportunity to develop a reading goal, like I mentioned in the previous section, and other resources to support independent reading. So here we have the web address. And then we also have this Project Gutenberg, which has compiled over 70,000 free ebooks. So you can go to this webpage and your students can access those free ebooks. Obviously, all of this requires internet connection. So if that's not the reality in your classroom, maybe this is something that you have to send for homework or something of that sort. But it depends, again, on your context and your reality. So to conclude, we can say that guided self-selected reading, GSSR, is a powerful tool in language acquisition that fosters autonomy, motivation, and long-term engagement with the target language. In the classroom, practical applications such as classroom libraries, reading workshops, and reflective practices help teachers implement GSSR effectively, leading to improved vocabulary, reading fluency, and overall language proficiency. What I want to stress here specifically is that one thing is developing the skill of reading as a skill within language teaching, right? And another is developing what we call our implicit linguistic system, which is separate from the skills of speaking, listening, reading, and writing, yeah? What I want to emphasize again here is that we've found that guided self-selected reading, of course, improves reading as a skill, but more than that, and perhaps more importantly, is that it improves language acquisition overall, yeah, through obviously improved vocabulary and just proficiency in general, because you see the language in a context. In the context is a story, right? So this really helps us with our proficiency as well. And to finish today, I would like to share a quote with you from a teacher librarian that I found on Edutopia. Edutopia is a website. They also have Instagram and they also have Facebook. They have some really interesting studies, information, techniques, ideas, quotes. It's a really nice webpage that I encourage you to follow. So this teacher librarian, Ryan Banney, says, if we want kids to become lifelong readers, then from a very young age, we need to let them read what they want to read. And this is crucial too. Remember to allow yourself to do the same. I cannot stress this enough. So in the context of language teaching and language learning / acquisition, yeah, if we can provide students with the opportunity to fall in love with the language through materials that they are actually interested in reading, we have a lot better chance of them becoming lifelong readers, but also becoming proficient enough in English where they can actually use the language to communicate. And ultimately, isn't that our goal as language teachers, to use the language to communicate? So GSSR is an outstanding, scientifically proven way to support language acquisition. I really hope that you decide to implement these techniques and ideas in your classroom in the future. I hope that you've learned something new. I hope that you are inspired to try some of these ideas in your classroom. And if you do, I would love to hear what the result is. So please, if possible, write me an email, let me know how things are going with GSSR in your classroom, in your reality. Thank you so much. Thank you for your invitation today. Thank you for taking this time to listen to me. And I really hope that we will be able to see each other in the future. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye.